On today's, on the other hand, we talk with someone working across lines of division in the faith community. Here's a sneak preview.
If we don't learn to love sinners, we're going to have a hard time finding anybody to love.
This is On the Other Hand. A podcast sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas that explores politics and other issues of importance to Arkansans. And we do this through having conversations with community leaders. Stay with us as we talk to another leader in Arkansas who works across differences to get things done and to bring us closer together. Well, Glenn, in the second part of our conversation with Preston, we talked a lot about his views on Christian nationalism and even the course that he taught for Life Quest. And, really he called the church into change, into being beyond just an American church, and to really think about love as our power rather than politics as our power. But I also was just captured by his idea that people in the pews are already, he used the word catechized, and they're really already culturized into believing certain things that a Sunday morning service is not going to get them out of. And that was really eye-opening to me.
Yeah, he was talking about it. We're catechized, which I guess my definition for those who are not familiar with the term would be we are taught, or we're enculturated. At any rate, it comes about through everything. The music we listen to, Spotify. He mentioned social media, the news, what people say, what we see and hear, just all over the place. When we get things like that, when we're taught things, when we're wrapped in a certain reality from those sources, then the church and the faith reality that they try to impart has quite a challenge.
So I hope go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say another thing that I thought was pretty striking was he mentioned somebody, I forget who, was talking about the importance of calling out the Muslim extremist who had, attacked the World Trade Center, and was asking when the Muslims would call out their extremists, and someone else said, "When will the Christians call out their extremists?" That was kind of powerful to me too.
Good question. So I hope people will listen to that second episode. Well, it's time for us to get to the third part of our conversation with Preston, where we're going to hear more about his thoughts and approach.
How can we emphasize these positive alternatives that we see about us in the world and in our interactions between faith, government, and people? How do we handle that? How do we develop a better way of encouraging the positive alternatives, whether we're talking about people of faith or people of a different faith or people with no faith?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to channel Parker Palmer once more. I'm a huge fan of his. He's a Quaker, and he writes, he spans disciplines in his writing, and I commend him to the audience. He wrote a book a few years ago called Healing the Heart of Democracy. And there we go. It's on the screen. That book moved me. One of the things he says in that book is that most human civilizations have three tiers. There's a private tier, a public tier, and a political tier. And in most ancient civilizations, the private tier was the least important one, namely because there wasn't much privacy. And it's where we get the word deprived, right? If all you have is a private life, you're living a deprived existence. But he says in our culture, we've kind of reversed that, where what we really want is privacy. But what we have done in our culture is diminished that middle tier, the public tier. we've allowed that to be eroded to the extent that most all public institutions in our culture are struggling, and we don't have public spaces for people. What that leaves us with is a private domain and a political domain. I think one of the reasons our politics is so contested today is that we feel like we're fighting for our lives because we've lost that that public dimension of our lives, where the only thing we really share, the only time we gather for public discourse is to talk about something political of which we're divided and polarized. So one of the things that I've sought to do is to try to be intentional about creating more public spaces where we cultivate the virtues that democracy demands. Parker Palmer would say we're building the infrastructure of democracy when we do that. That it's not just, infrastructure is not just highways and interstates, but it's also learning how to speak virtues to people, learning how to cultivate a common shared public domain together.
So, for instance, that could be churches or religions, but it could also be something like maybe public libraries and things like that.
Public libraries, public parks, book clubs, churches. Yeah, any place where you're gathering in public with people who may or may not disagree or may not agree with you, and you're talking about things that matter, right? I think he even mentions pubs, right? In England, that was what pubs were for. And we need more pubs. So here you have a Baptist preacher on your podcast advocating for more pubs today.
I'm writing that down.
But I do think he's on to something there, that we've lost public spaces. I think we need to recover that. And those spaces have to be spaces of trust. The scriptures teach us to preach the truth in love, speak the truth in love. For most of my life, what I thought that meant was we have to learn to say hard things in syrupy, sweet, Southern ways, right? Like we have to say pointed truth in loving ways. So how can we dull the truth down where the other person can accept it? I no longer think that's what that means. I think what that means is we really cannot speak the truth to people who do not know we love them. And without a foundation of love and shared humanity, then speaking the truth will always come off as condescension or judgment or vitriol even. I don't think the truth can live in places where there is not a foundation of love. So we have to create public places where there is a foundation of love and shared humanity so that we can talk about the things that matter. Even if at the end of those conversations we still don't agree on every jot and tittle of that truth. But we're looking each other in the eyes of our humanity, even if we can't quite see eye to eye. That's the work that I'm trying to do as a pastor of Second, and I think that's the need of this moment, is creating spaces like that. They're not private, they're not exactly political, but they're public, and yet they're fueled by human love and human connection. Anything other than that, I don't think it can save us in these days.
That's interesting. It reminds me of an initiative that the Rockefeller Institute has for civic education in Arkansas, which has had some pretty low ratings in some national surveys. And one of the 3 areas that they're deciding to focus on is exactly what you're talking about: public spaces, where people don't know where or how to get together with different people and have these, conversations that aren't fraught with hostility and defensiveness. So that's a good point. I've heard some things already from you that I think would address this next question. So let's see if you have any other thoughts on it. And that is that we need to do a better job of finding common ground with other people, particularly on difficult issues, so that we can collaborate. If we don't collaborate, if we don't compromise in democracy, problems are stuck and they don't get solved. So how can we improve that civility when we disagree upon some basic things? How can we find that common ground?
Yeah. And I want to start my response to this by commending Braver Angels. I think you're doing this work in a substantive way, as opposed to, I think most every American is concerned about the polarization of our country, right? Like, I think that's almost a universal concern. Unfettered polarization ends up in civil war, right? Like, so eventually we have to learn how to have real human connection, real human conversation across divides. I think one of the things, and I actually heard this from Monica Guzman. I was at a retreat last summer, and I heard her advocate for a commitment to people that is as strong as our commitment to our convictions, right? That I'm going to be as committed to you as I am to my truth. That still does not mean that I compromise my truth. It just means that I include you in the deliberation of my truth, right? That I've given you a good, honest, fair listening. So one of the things that Braver Angels has taught me, and a skill that I try to pass on to other people, is I want us to be as committed to one another as we are our own convictions. I think one of the challenges of our day is, I'll speak for myself, and I'm just going to talk out loud because I don't have an answer for this yet. I'm living this question personally. There are so many divides in our culture that it's almost like you have to choose the divide that you're crossing, right? The political divide in this country is but one amongst many. I think there's a racial divide in this country. And I would argue that most of what we're calling a political divide is actually a thinly veiled map over of a racial divide, is one of my core beliefs. So how do I cross a racial divide and stand in solidarity with Black people, my Black siblings and the Black church that has taught me so much, while also trying to reach rightward, maybe, and hold hands with my more conservative evangelical siblings of the faith who disagree politically from the vast majority of Black people of faith, right? Like, those are some of the dances that I think people are trying to do today. What I have appreciated about Braver Angels is I don't hear y'all saying that the answer is some vague middle ground, right? Or some compromising place. I think what you're advocating for is a culture where we can speak across divides and honor the humanity of everyone. What's different to me in this season is it feels like we're talking about issues that are inherently dehumanizing. So how do I carry on? How do I protect the humanity of people who are participating in realities that feel essentially dehumanizing? Those are the dances that I think people are trying to do today. And to step across two divides, it almost feels like you create three more. And I think we need braver angels. Certainly, I need more wisdom to know how to navigate some of the things that we're facing in this day. But those are the challenges that I feel in terms of crossing political divides of all shapes and sizes.
You know, I think in many ways, the approaches that, let's say, a religious faith takes to make things better and the ones that Braver Angels talks about seem different. Maybe in Braver Angels, we'd think about them as communication skills or conflict resolution skills. In a religious or faith-based setting, you might think of it in terms of love or adhering to a moral standard. I more and more see the commonalities in both of those. And I also see that incidentally in my history with the science of psychology. They all seem to converge at some point in talking about the same thing in different words. So are there any lessons? You've already talked about a lot of these things. There's so many ways to apply this, but any additional thoughts on how the Braver Angels approach and some of the skills that we specifically teach may apply or help in a religious or faith-based setting?
Yeah. I think about this often. Every Sunday in worship, we do a most conservative thing at Second Baptist, which is that we open up an ancient text. That's probably the oldest thing we read in the course of a year, most likely, unless we dig out some Homer or something. And we say, what can we learn from these ancient texts that have been conserved and passed down to us? And then I stand up and I do a most liberal thing, which is, I preach, which is to say, what does this ancient text have to say to our day and context? How does it speak to our situation and our struggles and our hopes and dreams? And we tell stories about liberation, right? So every Sunday in worship, Christian people do a most conservative thing and talk about most liberal things. I like to stop on occasion and say, what are conservatives trying to conserve and what are liberals trying to liberate, and to what? I think faith has a way of deepening conversations to a more substantive level where it's not just about where you stand on the issues of the moment, right? Like, that's what most people mean in our day by conservative and liberal is, how do you feel about fill in the blank issue? How do you vote? But it's so much bigger than that. It's so much more robust than that. And I think our faith can teach us lessons about that. On the flip side, I think Braver Angels can help foster in the church how to have difficult conversations. I do think most everything that has happened in American culture writ large happened in the American church about a decade or two earlier. And what I guess what that means to me is, if the church doesn't know how to talk about hard things inside our walls, if we lack the tools to have substantive conversation, we should not be surprised if we turn around and find a society that's fractured because we don't know how to have tough conversations. I do think most everything American culture needs in our day is locked in a trunk in the church's attic collecting dust. And I wish we could drag that back out and talk about shared humanity, talk about justice, talk about fairness, talk about mercy, talk about hospitality, talk about wisdom and learning from dissonance as much as we learn from consonance, right? Learning from people who differ from us as much as we learn from people who agree with us. All of that is deeply embedded in the Christian tradition. You don't have to be a woke talking head to find that stuff. Like, that's as old as Amos, right? But we've got to dig that out of the church's attic and knock the dust off and rediscover those tools. So, yeah, I think the church needs these communicative tools that you're teaching people. But I also think our common good today is crying out for a voice of wisdom. And I think the church has by and large vacated our seat at that table, if not corrupted the seat, decades before. So, yeah, I think that our culture needs a robust, vibrant, wise church in this moment. And I don't mean to be a skeptic, but I have a hard time seeing it when I scan the horizons. I see small little pockets of sanity, but I don't see it writ large in our culture.
Skeptic versus hope.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you a question about what brings you hope, but I want to recognize that you just mentioned that you don't see it writ large right now.
Can I respond to that real quick? I'm sorry to cut you off. I think I can communicate that better. And I said this last week at Second. I am a very hopeful person, but I'm also a skeptic and I'm a pessimist. And I say both. That seems contradictory. But when I think about hope, I think about a German theologian named Jürgen Moltmann, who, after World War II, started asking the question, what next? And he devoted most of his life to hope. And he wrote, when most people say the word hope, what they really mean is optimism. But they're two separate things. What he said was, optimism is when we take the evidence of this moment and project it onto the future. So, we pick up the newspaper in the morning and we read what's happening in the world and we say, oh, things are really going to get bad. Or, hey, things are looking up. The market's up today. And that's optimism. We project the present onto the future, which we don't really know. But he says that's not hope for Christian people. He says hope is when we take what we know of God's future and bring that to bear in this present moment. We live as if that future is true here and now. Your will be done, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So that hope does not wax and wane based on the evidence of the moment like optimism does. So, I just wanted to clarify that because I am a very hopeful person. And I do think despair is the enemy of hope, as I have heard said. When you despair, you give up. We can't lose hope. But I am pretty pessimistic and skeptical of the trajectories that I see in our body politic in this moment.
Thank you for that clarification. That's very helpful. And the redefinition of hope was really good. I'll have to be thinking about that. I think about and I agree. I maybe in Braver Angels we would talk about hope a little bit differently without bringing in the faith aspect. If we talk about civil dialogues or how can we improve family and politics and our conversations, then we have hope that we individually can do better and that might actually have some ripple effect on the people that we love. Mm-hmm. I think that's something for us to be thinking about. And I do wonder, what would you tell a parishioner of yours that's struggling with political polarization in their own relationships or family? Where's the starting place for them?
Yeah. And this is not an abstract question. It's I have people in my church that can't go home for Thanksgiving because of broken relationships, and I mourn that immensely. So this is a real live question that people are living. It's not just something we're pondering. I think politics matters because people matter. But we live in a day where I feel like politics uses people. And it gets to a place where people matter because of politics. It's no longer that politics matters because of people. It's that people matter because of politics. I think we need to right size that. And if that's not our starting ground, I'm not sure that we will make much progress. There's so much more to a person than how they vote. Mm. That's one of the things that I've tried to say to the people in my church that have had broken, hindered relationships is, can you see the virtue that lives in that person and name that, right? Like, none of us are all saints. None of us are all sinners. We're all some conglomeration and mess of the two. And if we don't learn to love sinners, we're going to have a hard time finding anybody to love. Mm. That does not whitewash any of the very real political and, I would argue, moral divides of our country. One of the things that I have done, sometimes this is effective and sometimes it's not, is I've tried to say to people who disagree with me on the political spectrum, especially if they're part of my history, I arrived at this political conviction because of virtues you taught me, right? And you are free for those same virtues to lead you to a different political conviction. But none of us are free to abandon the virtues themselves. What I see happening, and this is of concern to me in this country, is it feels to me like the things that we teach in private as virtues, the things we teach our children, right? Be responsible, don't lie, lying's wrong, you're a part of this family, forgive, be gracious, don't call names. Those same virtues don't seem to translate into the public arena. It's almost like we have one moral code privately for our living room and another moral code publicly for our politics. So what I've tried to do is to rewind that in places where I have the trust to do so, right? Where the other person or the group of people know that I love them. And I know they love me, even if they think I am off my chair crazy. And say, I arrived at this conclusion, though, because of the virtue that we cultivated together, the virtue that you taught me. So part of what I want to do, we can argue about the nuances of policy all we want to, and we should. There's health in that, right? But how can we rewind that and get down to a more basic, are we even agreeing on the same virtues anymore conversation? I have gotten some traction with that. And I think there might be some redemption in that. One last thing I'll say, and this is also something that Braver Angels has taught me. The odds that I'm going to change anyone's mind are about as high as the odds that they're going to change my mind, right? So maybe the goal for me is not to change their mind, which can simply be ego drivel on my part, right? I go around trying to change everyone's mind so they agree with me. In a way, that's fundamentalism. Mm. But maybe the goal is, how can I connect in real, substantive ways so that even if minds aren't changed right now, maybe they will someday, and the mind that may be changed may be mine. How can I keep this connection of a relationship alive and well? How can I nurture that so that they know that I love them even if I disagree with them? That's part of the hard work that we have to do, is not try to change people's mind, but to connect with people in real and substantive ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that works as long as neither side believes the other side is morally reprehensible or evil.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are going to be some family situations in which they may believe that you have chosen a path of moral reprehension or evil,
Right.
or I may be thinking that, and then you can't. It seems like that's if you start with that as a starting place, the connections are so much more difficult.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if your peace is not based on substantive truth, is there peace? Is that peace? Is that what we would call peace? Right? Like, I think that's part of the challenge of the moment. Is how do we speak of our convictions that humanize everyone, while trying to cross aisles and talk about policies and practices that seem to do the opposite of that? That's a real rub in our public discourse today, I think. And it's ripping apart churches down the center aisle. It's ripping apart dinner tables in family homes. And it's just very difficult to do, for sure.
So, Preston, if you had to pick one thing throughout your career or your life, what would you pick, the one thing you want to be remembered for?
A few years ago, when I was on sabbatical, I did a civil rights tour of the South. And as I was doing that, I was reading everything Martin Luther King Jr. ever preached or wrote. And, most of us think we know Martin Luther King Jr. We know the meme version, but we haven't gotten at the deep thought and conviction of Martin Luther King Jr. In one of his best sermons that I had not encountered until I read that, it's on the Good Samaritan. And he says, in my paraphrase, when we're walking down the road and we see someone in a ditch, we know what our faith demands of us, right? We lift that person out of the ditch, regardless of who we are or who they are. We lift that person. That's easy. We got that. But then he took it a step further. And he said, if you're going down the road and you see the ditches full of people, at some point, wouldn't that same love, that same neighbor love, compel you to say, there's something wrong with the road here? And that I can't just spend my life helping people out of ditches. We have to tend the road better. Doesn't the same love that lifts up people compel us to tend the road? I hope that when I'm dead and gone, if I'm remembered for anything, I think what I would like to be remembered for as someone who both helped people out of the ditch, but also did my best to tend the road. And I think that's what this moment is calling all of us to do.
Okay.
It's powerful.
It sure is. Well, then I tell you what, let's kind of wrap things up with your choice. We always like to end with a personal story from our guest. It can be anything you choose, light and funny, serious, inspirational, interesting. Just one story to wrap up.
Yeah. A few years ago, there was a gathering of pastors at Second Baptist, most of whom were Black pastors in the state of Arkansas. And we were talking about what to do, what public witness we could offer the world. And one of the Black pastors changed my life in about 45 seconds. He stood up and he said, I hope you'll forgive me if I'm not going to do any choir swaps or pulpit swaps anymore. He said, I'm really done with that. And he said, the problem of our day is not that Black people and white people in Arkansas don't have relationship. He said, we know each other. And he said, the issue back in the days of slavery was not a lack of relationship. the issue in the days of slavery was relationships of equality. That people who owned slaves and those who were enslaved had relationship, but they did not have a relationship of equality. He said, what I feel like is lacking from the white church today is appeals to equality. And he said, when I hear white pastors talk about justice, then I will know that we're ready for reconciliation to happen, but not before then. And that was a real eureka moment for me about how, my whole ministry, I've thought of myself as a peacemaker and a reconciler and a bringer together of varied people. But he taught me in that moment that justice is an essential component of that, if that reconciliation is to be real and activated in everyone's lives. So that was a good word for me and something that I carry with me and will continue to do so.
Well, really enjoyed having you here, Preston. Just great. I take notes, but I've taken a lot more than I usually do. Just chock full of good ideas. And I appreciate your continuing to be out in the community and sharing with others. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Well, thanks to both of you. And again, I really appreciate the work you do as individuals and Braver Angels as an organization.
Thanks for joining us on today's edition of On the Other Hand. This was the third part of our conversation with Preston Clegg. We hope that you'll listen to other conversations or contact us via our website, which you can find on the podcast page of our Braver Angels Arkansas website. And that can be found at arkansas.braverangels.org or on many popular podcast sites.
Check out our conversation with Caroline Stevenson, peace activist in Little Rock and community activist. You can find Caroline in episodes 28 and 29.
On the Other Hand is sponsored by Braver Angels in Arkansas. Music was composed by Randall Standridge of Jonesboro, Arkansas, and was performed by the University of Northern Colorado Symphonic Band, Dr. Richard Main, conductor.
From your host, Glenn White and April Chatham Carpenter, let's each do our part to bring our community closer together.